So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about lifts. There's a disclaimer. We have to put disclaimers in these days. I apologise that we need to do that, but we do. So I'm going to blast through a quick update on firefighters lift standards to start with. And the reason I'm going to blast through that is so that we've got the most time that we can to talk about evacuation lifts. Reason for that is quite easy. The firefighters lift standards are not changing very quickly at the moment, and I'll just update you on how they are changing, how they've changed recently. So only 3 slides on firefighters lifts. So we've got a 2020 version of EN 81-72. So EN 81 Part 72 is the European standard for firefighters lifts. I think the key line on this slide is that the 2020 version of EN 81-72 is technically identical, or the technical requirements are identical with the 2015 version. So I hear your question is, well, why on earth revise the standard to 2020? And the answer was that along with many other standards, the European Commission has been driving SEN to meet its requirements on the way European standards are drafted. And perhaps when we've got more time, we can go into the effect of the James Ellis case and the implications for standardization generally. But for now, the agreement between SEN and European Commission was a 2-stage agreement. So a quick revision of EN 81-72 2015 to address something called Annex ZA, which is at the back of the document and details how the clauses in the standard relate to the EHSRs of the relevant directive. And that was done quickly, and then the idea was that there would be later on a full revision of EN 81-72 to meet all the European Commission requirements, and that work has just started. So we've got EN 81-72 2020. It's technically identical with 2015. The good news is that the 2020 version is both harmonised and designated. So a designated standard is the standards post leaving the EU, standards that we need to follow in the UK to show or standards which give a presumption of conformity to the lifts regulations. And towards the bottom of the slide there, I've put the date by which the old 2015 standard will be withdrawn by SEN and BSI, and the date by which or date at which it will be withdrawn as a designated and harmonised standard, and they're not the same. But no one ever thought any of this stuff would line up, did they? So I mentioned earlier that the next full revision of EN 81-72 will be to address the fuller European Commission requirements. So there we are. We've got these 2 standards for the time being, but lift companies can declare against each of them when they install a firefighter's lift, and they are technically interchangeable. I think it's a bit more interesting now to talk about BS 8899, which is a standard published in 2016. It was, I think, from memory, October 2016. And that's the title of BS 8899 is Improvements of Firefighting and Evacuation Provisions in Existing Lifts, Code of Practice. So in the lifts world, we've got standards like EN 81 Part 80, which for many years now have given some guidance on how you improve a lift, you improve the safety of an existing lift. Back a few years ago at BSI's lifts committee, it was felt that something similar to that would be useful to give guidance for how you improve a lift to provide evacuation or firefighting operation. So that was the reason that work was done some years ago now. So and if we do a different session, it would be interesting, I think, to go more into BS 8899 and the whole question of how you improve existing lifts. I'll come back to that right at the end of the presentation. Now, a number of the points I'm going to make here are kind of born out of questions that we see or have thrown at us, and one of them is really I just want to suggest that a request to improve an existing lift to make it a firefighting lift is a misnomer, and the reason for that is that if we talk about a firefighting lift, we're talking about a lift that was originally designed and installed to a British standard, which was BS 5588 Part 5, and that standard existed from the mid 1980s up, and the last revision, the last issue, was 2004. So if we're talking about a firefighting lift now, we would go and pick up 5588 Part 5 2004, and in it we would find that it refers for the lift parts to EN81 Part 72 2003. In other words, it refers to firefighters lift standard for its lift parts. So if we're improving or changing a lift to make it a firefighting lift now, in fact we wouldn't. We should be making a firefighters lift. A firefighter's lift is a lift that conforms to EN81 Part 72, and when it does, it can be fitted with the pictogram that you see on the slide. That's the same pictogram that I've just picked it up out of EN81 Part 72. So if we're talking about improving existing lifts, obviously the gold standard is to make it to an EN81 72 lift. And BS 8899 has a lot of recommendations about what happens if you, for some reason, because of the building design, cannot achieve an EN81 72 level, and there's various dispensations or flexibilities in that standard. In that case, if you fall short of making a full EN81 72 type lift, then you've not got a firefighter's lift, and then BS 8899 points to a label, which again I've picked it up here on the bottom left, which gives some indication of the features that are provided on the lift, but you'd not then use the pictogram. The pictogram must not be used if it's not an EN81 72 lift. If modernising a lift that doesn't, if you come across a modernised lift and it's not a firefighter's lift, then it needs another term. It's not a firefighting lift. It's probably not an old fireman's lift. So there's a new term in 8899 called a modernised lift for fire service use. So we'll come on to the different types of fire service lift on another slide, but so that's the EN81. Sorry, that's BS 8899 in a nutshell. At the bottom is a link to some guidance that we've done. So whenever you see a guidance, that's actually guidance that Lear have published on its website. You're welcome to have a look at that. I'm sure we'll be doing a lot more in the future. Now, another question we get asked a lot at the moment, and I think will be more and more prevalent, is the whole issue of identifying what it is, what operation of fire, so what lift operation event of fire you have in a building, and to identify the specification of lift that's installed. And the reason I think that's going to become much more prevalent, Farouk mentioned the Fire Safety Act, and we're going to see also a revision of the Fire Safety Order from 2005. And also when you look at the requirement for people in the building responsible person to do a fire risk assessment, they will need to identify what lifts they have. And anyone who's watched, I think, the Grenfell inquiry unfold will know that the people responsible for that building didn't seem to be terribly clear about what they had. They thought they had firefighting lifts, but in fact it appears they had firemen's lifts. So a fireman's lift, and Gina, I apologise, but that is what they were called back in the 1970s, firemen's lift. So a fireman's lift is a lift that was described in BS 2655 back in the 1970s. Very simple lift with car preference control and a switch at the fire access level that allowed a lift to be simply taken under the control of a firefighter. And that was around until about the mid-1980s, when that standard we saw earlier, BS 5588 Part 5, was published and actually gave combined requirements for a lift and for the building designed to accommodate the lift. And as we also saw, that firefighting lift standard ran until 2004, and since then we've had firefighters lifts to BS EN81-72. And on the previous slide I lobbed in this new term because we might have some sort of hybrid. We've got a modernised lift for fire service use. So immediately there's at least 4 different types of lifts that might have been used or might be used by fire service personnel. And then we lob in also evacuation lifts to BS sort of 9999, and also add in the fire recall features that we see on lifts as well. There's actually quite a lot of complexity in this area. So when on the slide I asked the question, is this complicated? It is, with my tongue in my cheek. This is an area which is, I think, causing a lot of concern, and essentially an area where we all have to work together, I think, to be clearer in the terms that we use, a little bit more precise in the terms that we use, and to communicate with each other using the right terms. And I think making a lot of effort over the next few years to identify what it is precisely we've got installed in various buildings and to work accordingly. And not surprisingly, at the bottom of the slide there's a link. So that's as much as I want to say about firefighters lifts or lifts of fire service use at the moment, although there's way more we can say and come back to. Turning to evacuation lifts and just seeing how we're doing on time. So Farouk mentioned lots of the same documents, lots of the same work here that I'm mentioning on this slide. So we've got the Grenfell Tower inquiry. I don't want to talk directly about that, but although it lies behind everything we're talking about today. There's the building safety bill going through Parliament. That's going to be pretty huge. That's going to help change the whole environment, I think, for you know, obviously for building safety. But I'd like to think that a lot of the problems and issues which our industry saw over the last few years, I'd like to think that the building safety bill is going to help fix some of those. But it's there. And again, I mentioned a revision of the fire safety order. Little comment there, watch this, because I think it will say something about lifts quite explicitly. And I think when a draft of those regulations come along, you never know. If I do mind my P's and Q's today, Gina might invite me back. We might get to talk about that, because I think that's a very important piece of legislation that's coming down the line for us. And also, Farouk mentioned approved document B of the building regulations. There are research projects going on underpinning all that work. One of them's involving research on means of escape, and it's looking at lifts. And I suspect some people on the call will be aware of that and involved in that. Incidentally, I was looking down the attendance list during Farouk's excellent presentation, and I see there's plenty of old friends and colleagues, and really a very high-class bunch of people here today. So yeah, that's good to see, and thank you for your support. So really what I want to do this afternoon very briefly is touch on the London plan, touch on the draft EN 81-76, this European standard that's been drafted on evacuation lifts, and also touch on the work on BS 991, all of which, of course, Farouk mentioned. And I'm not going to say very much about the London plan because Adam will give us an excellent overview of that later, far better than I can, except that I want to just point out that I think last year, with the London plan being published and having this explicit reference to having a minimum of one evacuation lift per corps, it sort of fired the starting gun or lit the blue touch paper, whatever you want to, however you want to look at it. It really kick-started a lot of what we're now doing. There's a lot of pieces of work going on, not necessarily meshed together as well as they might, but certainly the London plan was the one that I think really got us off to a start. The point, and Adam will cover this later. So one of the things which the London plan guidance did, which got us a little excited, is it referred to BS EN 81-76 as if it were published, and of course it isn't, and it wasn't, and it won't be for a while yet. So the GLA modified that guidance so that it refers to BS EN 81-76 when published. So in the meantime, we should be working to BS 991 and BS 9999. So let's talk more about EN 81 Part 76, or the draft 81 Part 76. Now, I can't quite believe it, but work at SEN started in 2014. You can tell immediately that it's taken a long time to get wherever we are today. And there are reasons for that. One of them is, frankly, despite there being the earlier CEN-TS 81-76 published in 2011, there's very little convergence across Europe on what an evacuation lift should look like. So it's just taken a lot of work to try and build a consensus on that working group. Incidentally, the title of EN 81-76 is Evacuation of Persons with Disabilities Using Lifts. And everything I'm going to say about evacuation lifts for the rest of today is about evacuation lifts for people who cannot use the stairs. There's another topic which we can go into separately, and Farouk touched on it. It's the general evacuation of the building population. There's actually an ISO standard that deals with that, which is ISO 18870. Funnily enough, that's about to be revised. I think that's a separate topic, and just for my sanity, I've not gone there today in this presentation. So we've got this work ongoing on EN 81 Part 76, and you might recall that we actually had a draft come out for public comment at the end of 2019. And it was pretty heavily commented. And it also, the commenting phase on that finished around about the time that the pandemic kicked off. So for reasons of the heavy workload due to all the comments and the pandemic hitting, work at SEN really, it failed to address all the comments before the end of the allotted time period. And under SEN rules, the old work timed out and a new work item was needed. So work has been going on the draft, and it will come back out for public inquiry, we think in May. But it's never a good thing to hang your hat on a date for a standard coming out. They very often, times can very often go backwards, although they very rarely come forwards. So all I really wanted to say is that we'll talk about the draft EN 81-76. There's no guarantee of what the final version will look like yet. And I'm afraid to say there's not even a guarantee that BSI would publish it as as a British standard. And the reason I say that is that BSI did vote negatively on the public inquiry that finished in early 2020. In the meantime, it's the evacuation lift in BS 9999 remains the only description of an evacuation lift in British standards. And funnily enough, at the bottom of the slide, lo and behold, another link to a bit of guidance which might be useful. So I need to spend a wee bit of time, I think, on the draft of EN 81-76, and even at the risk of maybe going a little over time. If you read the draft EN 81-76 a couple of years ago when it was out for comment, you'd have seen it had 3 optional modes. Now, a driver-assisted evacuation, which was much like the way BS 9999 describes a driver-operated evacuation lift, or was described in the CEN TS 81-76. In other words, there's a recall switch at the ground floor or the exit floor. Someone takes control of the lift, and then a lift driver drives the lift to the floors where disabled people are awaiting evacuation. So that's something we think we understand reasonably well. We've had it in British standards for 30+ years. Something new that was introduced in the draft of EN 81-76 was the idea of an automatic evacuation operation. And so the idea that in the event of fire, the lift will recall to the exit floor. But after that, it might go back into service, and there should be then some sort of prioritization of landing calls, allowing the lift to shuttle between floors where service is needed and the exit floor. And we'll talk about a little bit more about that in a moment. And then this third mode is the remote assisted mode, much like the driver assisted mode, except that the control for this is remote from the evacuation lift. And you can see the big note at the bottom that BSI weren't very happy with that. And part of the problem is that that panel, that remote control panel, can be literally around the corner from the lift, or it could be on the moon. And I think the implications of having a lift remotely controlled from a remote location by people outside the immediate control of the building management, I think that was a concern for people at BSI when it was commented 2 years ago. I want to unpack each of those 3 modes a little bit more. Remember that each 3 are optional. So actually, as the draft EN 81-76 is constructed, it's potentially a very complex standard. You can have any combination of 3. So in other words, there's 7 different permutations of evacuation lift you might have. So driver assisted evacuation, I think I can get through this quite quickly. We think we know it. It's similar to what we already see in BS 9999. Lift recalls to the exit floor on a fire alarm or on the evacuation lift switch, and then the rescue team takes control of it. The lift will only respond to car calls, so people using the landing calls to register their need for service. That just lights up indications in the lift car. So I think we know about these. I've got 1 plus and 1 minus at the bottom there. The big plus is that if you've got a driver and a rescue team, they can respond to site conditions. They can use the Mark 1 eyeball to see what's going on in the building at that moment, and as they serve all the various different landings. The big negative is from the moment the fire alarm grounds the lift to the moment someone actually takes control and starts using it, that lift is not available. And I think that's a concern for some people, that early on in the fire, when arguably risks are lower, the lift's not available, and it's not available for however long that the mobilization time is of the of the team that are going to use the lift. That's driver-assisted evacuation. I think the automatic evacuation operation is the one perhaps of most interest to us now. So if the fire alarm goes, as you'd expect, the lift will recall to the exit floor. It may then go back into service in this automatic mode, but that has to be signalled by some kind of intelligence system in the building, be that a fire alarm and detection system or a BMS system. But I think this is an important prerequisite. There needs to be some system in the building that's able to determine that it's safe for the lift to return to a normal, not to a normal use, I apologise, to an automatic evacuation operation. Another big issue is that, so if you in EN81, the draft EN81-76, how do you then prioritize lift operation? And there's two suggestions in the draft. One is that you prioritize the call furthest from the exit floor, a very simple operation, and the other one, a more complex one, is that there's a more complex signaling between the building system and the lift that will indicate where the fire floor is and to prioritize the floors nearest the fire. This is a really important, and I think it's going to be a really tricky area to get right. But at the moment, the draft of EN81-76 just says that whatever that is, whatever call prioritization that is subject to negotiation, should be discussed and agreed between building designer and lift provider. I suspect we can come back to this and unpack these bits a lot more in the future. Big plus with the automatic evacuation operation is that potentially the lift can be used quickly after the fire alarm's gone. It doesn't need a driver. It can use those precious minutes between the fire alarm going off and rescue teams being mobilised. But there are certain negatives, or certain, maybe not negatives, but certain issues which need to be looked at and considered. So I touched on the first one already, is it some sort of system that actually is able to decide whether it's safe for the lift to go back into some sort of operation. Another issue is, or question is, how we prioritise an automatic operation for disabled users. What's to stop ordinarily ambulant people using the lift or lifts? If the lifts have been provided according to some sort of capacity or an evaluation of the number of people in the building, but then other people start using them, then arguably the escape of people that need the lifts is being impeded or slowed down. So I think this is a really important area for us to think about, how we ensure that lifts are provided for the evacuation of disabled people, or people cannot use the stairs, how those lifts are prioritised for their use. Earlier on, I touched on the area of call prioritisation, but I think that's a tricky area of discussion between building designers and lift providers. I think that's going to be a big area for future work together to get something sorted out on that. And then the other thing is, for automatic mode, is how suitable is it for a building with transient users, in other words. So it's obviously quite useful when people have learned the building and they know what they need to do if the fire alarm goes off. But what about buildings with transient users? Maybe this is less useful as a solution there. So just turning to remote assisted evacuation, and I don't want to talk very much more about that because frankly, I think it's problematic, as I've mentioned earlier, but also it's quite easy to explain. It's similar to the driver assisted solution, except with a remote control panel. But then with the remote control panel, is that part of the lift? Probably not. How is it then that it can fall within the conformity assessment procedure of a lift installer? I think there's a lot of practical problems with this, as well as issues to do with cyber security and ensuring that whoever's taking control of the evacuation is trained and competent to do so. So that's touching on the work at SEN to develop EN 81-76. Oh, that it was so simple that we just waited for that. BS 9999, as Farouk mentioned earlier, that's lined up and that's going to be revised. That's the code of practice for fire safety and design, management and use of buildings. So that's the standard actually at the moment, has the description of a UK evacuation lift in it. But that work is queued up behind a revision of BS 9991, which is fire safety and design, management and use of residential buildings. And here's the interesting bit, because in last August, I think it was, we saw the draft for public comment come out, which had proposals for an evacuation lift based on the driver assisted evacuation we've just looked at, plus the option of an automatic evacuation operation dependent on certain building factors being present. So that was very interesting. The lifts part was quite heavily commented, but the standard as a whole, the document as a whole, was very heavily commented. There were 1,866 comments. The revision panel are working through, the whole revision panel working as a whole unit is working through all those comments. That makes it slow going, although it's the right way to work. So it might mean that a final published BS 9991 is not going to be imminent. And as I said, for other draft standards, there's no guarantee that what was in the DPC for evacuation lifts will come out in the final version. There's a lot of comments on the lift sections. I've mentioned 9991 is undergoing comment resolution, and that is a joy for everybody that's involved in it. I say that a bit facetiously. It's important work, and I've never seen work at BSI that has been so completely and conscientiously committed to by a bunch of people before. We've touched on it in 81-76 in that draft. We expect the second public inquiry to be in May this year. Now, I'm going to say we should comment, and that's we as a lifts fraternity. We might see a new standard published next year. There is a question about how we resolve the fact that we might have two standards running in parallel, both talking about evacuation lifts. One suggestion is that the national forward of EN 81-76 could be used to set out how it relates to the content of BS 9991. I'll just leave that there. We can come back to that later. As I mentioned, revision of 49s will follow later. 49s is where we've currently got the only description of an evacuation lift. Last slide, Gina. I think it's quite important. We've talked about the standards which deal with new equipment in new buildings, and for sure the new BS 9991 and all the other standards I've just talked about, they will form the benchmark for new equipment in new buildings. Something which struck me from COP26 was, and it's obvious, we know this, we all know this, we all know that 80% of the buildings that we have today will be in use in 2050. But sometimes, you know, you just need to remind yourself that that means that if we want to improve building safety, if we want to improve the firefighting and evacuation capability of lifts in buildings, it's primarily a problem of upgrade. And I think that puts the spotlight back onto a future revision of BS 8899 to provide some guidance on that. And I say at the bottom, existing buildings might be more interesting. So I used to know rock climbers, and rock climbers had two words. They had, one word was interesting and another word was exciting. Interesting meant that they nearly fell off a bit of rock when they were climbing it. Exciting meant that they actually did fall off.